everyone. Welcome to our joint webinar once again. On behalf of ESC Spectrum and Trinity Consultants, Adam Jackson and I would like to thank all of you once again for taking the time to attend our four-part series on the role of the DAS and some best practices. Today's webinar is going to cover your Part 75 monitoring plans and the certification process overview. Before we begin, my name is Steve Argabright. I'm a CEMS Specialist for Trinity in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Joining me today once again for part 3 of our presentation is Adam Jackson with ESC Spectrum. Adam's their Business Development Coordinator. Say hello, Adam.
Hey guys, this is Adam Jackson, Business Development Manager for ESC Spectrum. I'm based in Houston, Texas, and represent the largest DOS by volume in the United States.
Thanks, Adam. Both Adam and I have spent a lot of time with data acquisition handling systems from the unholy trinity of regulatory software and hardware associated with these types of systems. We have both done a lot, and I do mean plenty of field work with these systems over the years, and we'll probably die on our keyboard doing it for many, many more. We will be asking everybody who's listening in today, all of you are participating, to post your questions during the webinar, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can, time permitting. Mr. Jackson, you have anything to add before we begin today?
Yeah, so on the questions, there's going to be a questions pane. If you want to ask something, we're going to be monitoring that real time. I'm going to be in the background reviewing your questions, queuing up responses, and then at the end of the presentation we're going to hold a Q&A session where we will hit every question individually. If we don't know the answer to something, we will get to you later by email or phone. If we have a question that comes up that is unrelated to CEMS monitoring plan, but you want to ask something about ESC or Trinity specifically, we're going to have our contact information at the end of this presentation, and we encourage you to contact us directly.
Okay, thank you, Adam. To begin, presentation today is entitled Your Part 75 Monitoring Plan and the Certification Process Overview. With regard to ESC Spectrum, they are based in Austin, Texas. ESC Spectrum provides the most widely used CEMS DAS software in the U.S. Their DAS is the market leader in helping the industrial and utility plants comply with your federal, your state, your local air quality regs requiring continuous monitoring. Their CEMS services provide expert integration, maintenance, repairs, training, stack testing, and more. Speaking for my own company, Trinity, since its founding in '74, we have expanded our geographic footprint. I just discovered the other day we have almost 1,000 employees across the world. We attribute our continued growth to a focus on cornerstone values of top-notch technical performance and excellence in client service. Our solutions are delivered uncommonly well. We are local everywhere, quality, responsiveness. We're passionate about getting back to the customer as quickly as possible with a good solution to their regulatory issues. Sorry, everyone, I'm having a mild audio issue here. Give me just a moment. Okay. To begin, on the subject of federal monitoring plans, the bulk of your information resides within Part 75 subparts F and G, also known as the record keeping and reporting requirements. And under subpart F, you will find the general provisions, the contents, certain specific situations for gas-fired and oil-fired baseload or peaking units. Subpart G covers your monitoring plan submittals, and your submissions are in the context of either electronic or hard copy for everything related to the monitoring plan they talked about in subpart F.
Now, to add a little bit to that, most of the Part 75 facilities are going to be power generation focused. And so for anybody that's on the phone right now that doesn't come from the power industry, you may have triggered some regulations. Maybe there's a consent decree. Maybe there's something local regulatory-wise that has triggered you to be a Part 75 reporting facility, which has driven your monitoring plan. So if you're not power, I encourage you to go back and review your permit and really understand why you're doing the monitoring plan.
Your additional monitoring plan information can be explained in much simpler terms within two standard publications out there on the web, the Plain English Guide to the Part 75 Rule and the 2013 publication of the Part 75 Emissions Monitoring Policy Manual. You can even drill down into the elements of the federal monitoring plans themselves at this website location at the CAMD page. But to dive right in, all monitoring plans consist of two distinct parts. While they're related to each other, they are distinct, and one is electronic, the other is hard copy.
Now, on some of these resources, for the monitoring plan for figuring out how to build one, what the auditor is going to look on, there's one that's not on here. And if you Google Part 75 Field Audit Manual, the Field Audit Manual will take you through all the components of a monitoring plan and essentially a Q&A session for how to train an EPA field auditor for what to ask you when they come to your site. So it's good background information to ensure that you're testing yourself and auditing your own monitoring plan to make sure that you've got all the required components for the EPA.
That's a good point, Adam. Another source of information is if you're evaluating your quarterly reports through ECMPS, is the reporting instructions themselves. They dive deep into the elements of the monitoring plan as well. This comes in super handy when you're trying to troubleshoot or even add or modify an entry in it. But an electronic monitoring plan is arranged in an XML format. XML stands for an extensible markup language, and it's a plain text format for encoding documents. Relatively easy to read, but uncommon for any other reason in an electronic monitoring plan. And it will contain such information as your unit type, max heat input, the operating ranges of your gross load or steam load, fuels that you use, any add-on emissions controls you might have, your unit or stack configuration, whether it's a single unit, a single stack, a common stack, multiple stacks, etc. The type of methodology that you use for monitoring, whether that is a full-on acid rain CEMS, Appendix D for your gas or gas and oil, Appendix C or LME, which stands for low mass emission monitoring. The systems information itself, the components that you use for monitoring your pollutants, make, model, serial numbers of each analyzer, etc. The equations that you use to calculate your emission rates, your mass emissions, your heat input, etc. And your analyzer span and range information.
Now, a couple of things on the XML format. Just keep in mind that your monitoring plan is public information. Anybody on this phone call right now can go look up your specific plant on the EPA portal, and you can download the information. So if you want to see what your monitoring plan looks like today, you can certainly do that. And as far as the equations are concerned, if you take a look at your DOS, there's a equations spot inside the DOS that's got every one of the calculations. One of the strengths of the ESC Stackvision DOS is we publish the equations to our users, and it makes it super friendly to audit the monitoring plan back to exactly what the DOS is saying you should be doing.
Now, the hard copy portion of your monitoring plan is that which, for the most part, doesn't change a whole lot. Your electronic portion can change much more frequently by comparison, but your hard copy includes the supplemental information that is really incompatible with electronic style reporting. That includes your schematics, your blueprints, flow diagrams, test protocols that you would use for initial or recertification, technical justifications, any vendor documentation, fuel analysis reports, The hard copy cover letter that contains the acid rain certification statement under 7221. I hereby certify, blah, blah, blah. Take note here that Part 75 does allow all of your monitoring plan information, including that hard copy portion, to be stored electronically in soft copy, provided that you can hit the button and a paper copy can be printed out in a format suitable for viewing upon request.
Yeah, so that's something to consider for your local agency and what region you're in. So, word on the street, EPA Region 6 says we don't want to see the hard copies at all. Like, do not send them to us. You would swamp us with data. So the best practice is really to keep a hard copy in your manual. I typically keep it with the CEMS QA/QC manual, and then have the PDF version on the server ready to go in case they ask for it. And then you have the electronic version that's submitted through ECMPS that you can go and find anytime through the EPA portal.
But as always, keep backups, because you never know. 3-ring binder might just wander off. It happens.
It does.
As far as the initial monitoring plan, the initial evaluated electronic portion of your monitoring plan goes to EPA, goes to CAMD via the ECMPS reporting platform. And the hard copy usually goes to the regional office in your state agency. Any critiques that occur, any comments, observations get sent to you, the state, and your region. And both portions of the monitoring plan get reviewed for errors, for discrepancies, for anything that needs to get added, anything that needs to get corrected. Now, hard date on that is that submittal needs to occur within 21 days of your initial certification test date. As far as resubmittals, if you have to make any changes, whether that involves electronic or hard copy, they do require periodic updates. Your electronic would be required 21 days prior to initial certification, at the time of each recertification submission, and before or during quarterly report submittal, where an update of the electronic monitoring plan is required. And what that means is just make the change. Where we'll get into it here in a bit, where updates are expected to occur on a semi-frequent basis. With regards to the hard copy, that needs to occur 21 days prior to your initial certification testing. Beyond that, only if something physical changes about the process. And that is a change in the schematics, a change in the flow of data, the flow of information has undergone some kind of revision. Once again, all of this can be stored electronically as soft copies, provided that a paper version of your hard copy portion can be furnished upon request. So let's dig in. Your maximum potential concentration, covered under Appendix A in Part 75. Your maximum potential concentration is based upon the fuels that produce the highest measured concentration of SOx or NOx. This is also the same value that is used to determine your span and range values on your instruments. And it's meant to be a long-term kind of value. The expectation there is the only time it gets modified is if a change occurs in the fuel that you burn, the manner that you operate the unit, an annual span evaluation, or some kind of regulatory audit identifies your MPC as improper, which would also mean that your span might be off as well. Using SO2 as an example, it usually uses the maximum percentage sulfur content and minimum gross calorific value of the highest sulfur fuel that you burn from the last 12 months of fuel data or fuel contract values. There are equations in the regs, A1 alpha, A1 bravo, that you would use as appropriate to determine your max potential concentration. As far as your NOx potential, you have multiple options for determination. You use a default value based on boiler type or fuel specific. Your NOx MPC can be based on the last 720 operating hours of historical data. You can use estimates from the manufacturer. You can use emission test values.
And this NOx and SOx MPC value, this is something that is entered into your DOS. This is something a DOS can handle for you. So the DOS is the data acquisition handling system portion of the CEMS. And if you go into your DOS, you should have a module that does MPC, that if you do elect to do the historical data the last 720 hours, it can do that calculation for you quickly. It can also help evaluate the range and operations that you've operated in, and then it'll also evaluate whether or not your NOx or SOx analyzers are spanned properly. This is a very common issue that I find on CEMS QA/QC audits in the past, and it's a relatively easy thing to resolve, but it's not something that you would normally be looking at on a routine basis. So just on a quarterly time frame, this is something I would do as a housekeeping item while you're doing your EDR.
Another element of your monitoring plan is your expected concentration, your maximum expected. Whereas your max potential is a value that occurs before your emissions controls, your maximum expected concentration is based upon the fuels that produce the highest measured SOx or NOx after your add-on controls, or when your lowest emitting fuel is combusted. For those of you that have dual ranges, your low range is usually determined based on this MEC value. And you can use the same equations that determine max potential, A1 alpha, A1 bravo. Your MEC can be derived from your max potential. You can refer to table 61 as an example within the ECMPS monitoring plan reporting instructions, also known as the criteria for MPC, MEC, and another anagram here, max potential flow determinations.
Yeah, and again, this is just DOS data 101. So this is stuff that the DOS has a historical representation of how you've operated. And you can use that data to produce these analyses and get the derived equations and also the derived values for MEC, MPC. And then pay special attention to if you do have the dual range analyzers, for example, NOx. If you have the low span where it's like 0 to 9 ppm, and then you have a higher span, the problem area is typically going to be in the lower span. So just take a look at that on your monitoring plan, go back and evaluate historical operations, and make sure that you're spanned properly for your analyzers.
This is an example of those monitoring plan equations that I was referring to, A1 alpha, A1 bravo, where you're determining your MPC or MEC, A1 alpha, A1 bravo, A2. They're not really as bad as they look. It's just math. And your maximum emission rate. These are your worst case emission rate values based upon your max potential in conjunction with the expected values of a minimum CO2 or maximum O2 diluent where applicable. You can also use historical diluent or diluent cap values if applicable here. The diluent caps spec'd under 2121 of Appendix A indicates that if you're a boiler, your CO2 is capped at 5%, your O2 is capped at 14%, as opposed to turbine, your caps are 1% for CO2 and 19% for O2 there. And as always, the standard NOx emission rate formula can be used to calculate that MER, CO2 versus O2 as your diluent in here, also using a CO2 based fuel factor or a dry fuel factor. And this is the table in the monitoring plan that you would routinely see if you're going in and inspecting it. This is a clip from an existing monitoring plan the point here is that when you go in and modify values over time, you tend to retire the older values and add on new ones. You almost never delete something from your monitoring plan. It's meant to be dynamic. It's meant to be living. And because resubmittals do occur periodically, you want to retain those historic values in the event of a resubmittal. That way the DAS knows to utilize depending on when you happen to resubmit, the DAS will know to utilize a previous value versus a current one and try and preserve those historic values. Really, as you update your monitoring plan, the earlier values just get retired. New values are activated, new dates.
That's correct. So it's just a continuous history of the operations of your facility, the facility layout, the emissions criteria, and it's kind of like blockchain technology. So you always know where you were before. And sometimes on a CEMS QA/QC audit, what we'll find here is that you've had a unit that got retired. Maybe you switched from dual fuel to single fuel, or maybe you switched from single fuel to dual fuel, and there's historical data in here that's no longer representative of your facility. It's a very simple fix. Just go in and make sure that there's an end time associated with those values that you're no longer using.
Now let's get into updating the monitoring plan. Like Adam was talking about, this is meant to be a dynamic document, a living document. It is the basis for your monitoring systems, your unit's monitoring systems, your emissions calcs, your monitoring methodologies. And as a direct quote, any modification, replacement, or other change to an approved monitoring system or monitoring methodology, the monitoring plan must be updated using ECMPS through the platform. And believe it or not, updating your electronic monitoring plan is a good thing by comparison to the way it used to be. Because in the 90s, everything was still flat file submittals, and it took ungodly amounts of time. Something as simple as an analyzer replacement, changing your qualifications, changing fuel flow methodologies from a certified gas flow meter attached to the unit to a billing meter that was outside the fence. Changing a DAS, doing any span or range changes used to take infinitely longer because everything was done as a flat file submission. Having an electronic browser base that allows you to modify, import, and submit ad hoc is a huge time saver by comparison to what it used to be. But the point here now is, as far as updating, now you generally need to resubmit the electronic portion of your monitoring plan annually.
Yeah, I think it used to be quarterly, right, Steve? And then they switched to annually. I think it was right around the ECMPS transition. Don't quote me on that, but you're right. Before ECMPS, we had to do all of this by hand, and it's not fun. The thing to consider here is when you're doing the updating, if you're going to go through a audit cycle, I usually line up my monitoring plan updating with a reporting cycle. So that way I'm looking at all the data at the same time. So whether it's the first of the year, maybe it's the mid-July EDR submittal season, and something that to consider that when you have a multi-stack facility, something very easy to do, especially if you have identical units. Let's say you have 2 gas turbines, go look and make sure that those 2 turbines are identical. See if there's anything different in the equation, see if there's anything different in how they're set up fuel flow wise, any of those types of parameters that could be changed, even the GCV between the 2 turbines, especially if they share a common fuel line. So those are some common findings that we find on the CEMS QA/QC audits, is that it's real easy to determine if you've got something wrong, if you've got multiple units, if one of them is different.
Right. Now, again, with talking about updating your monitoring plan, the electronic portion is a dynamic publication with sort of an annual update requirement. You don't have to submit your monitoring plan with every quarterly report like you used to in the flat file days, unless some aspect of the electronic portion has changed. changes to spans on your analyzers, default constant changes, monitoring methodologies. You can update it anytime through the portal, through the reporting platform. As an example, if you're a coal-fired site, you tend to update more often based upon span value or load changes. If you're a gas-fired site, an Appendix D site, you tend to update more often based upon your gas-fired or peaking qualifications records. And that does happen without fail in the first quarter of every year. You have to go through and update that particular record. Once again, here are just some examples of spans that change. The values are retained for historical purposes and potential resubmittals if that has to occur, and the new ones begin the later date, a later hour. The below example is your qualifications record, where every year you may not have to file a new peaker qualification record, but you always have to update your gas-fired qualifications annually. First quarter, every year, gas-fired sites always have a reason to submit their monitoring plan, resubmit their monitoring plan annually. Talking about span and range, you have to make periodic evaluations of your maximums, spans, and ranges for each monitor. That's for SOX, NOx, backflow, diluents, and keep copies of these for potential audits, because you never know. You have to examine your historical CEMS data annually to see if the current span or range values meet those guidelines. The idea being the full scale range that you select on your monitor, better than 50% of it has to be recorded during normal operation. Those values fall between 20 and 80% of full scale. You, in practice, always want better than that, but even if it's 51%, it counts. The exceptions there, of course, being any low sulfur fuel data, which you would exclude from the evaluation. Any trial burns, different blends, it can vary. If you have to make any adjustments to the span and range as a result of your span evaluation, you have 45 days to implement them after the quarter ends, unless you have to order new calibration gases, and then they give you another quarter to get it done.
And all of these things sound super complicated, but if you've got a CEMS DOS, like for example in our ESC Stackvision platform, most of these things are a push of a button and it spits out the data and it tells you exactly where your spans fall. It'll evaluate it per that 50% criteria between the 20 and 80%, and it'll tell you yes or no, you're good. If you're not good, like Steve said, you can simply update the data, go do the changes in the field, and then make sure that you've implemented these changes post-quarter.
And I don't want to marginalize this. Your span and range evaluation is an annual requirement. It's not just so much that it's a best practice. It's a really, really good practice as well. ECMPS, for example, if you're using it, tends to point out any online operation in your emissions EDR critiques when you are exceeding, when you are going above. You certainly don't want a full-scale exceedance to be a regular occurrence on your system, which is why that on an annual basis you want to find out exactly how many times you're popping above 80% on your ranges. It really does make sense to do. And that pretty much covers the subject of monitoring plans. I kind of want to deviate a little bit into an overview of the certification process at this point and how it relates to the monitoring plans themselves. Before we start diving into this, Adam, do we have any questions coming through yet?
We had a few for the field audit manual, and so what we can do is we can post the link, or at least send out the link to the resources that we've defined here in this presentation. We can provide the EPA links, and so the manual that I was referring to was the EPA Part 75 Field Audit Manual, and they typically keep that thing up to date. And it's not just monitoring plan; it goes through every single component of a CEMS and a DAS and the QA/QC plan, and how the EPA would audit you, and they train their folks on the questions to ask, and they even get to the specificity of going to plant manager, operations manager, the type of questions they would ask for those types of individuals. So it's really good resources for you preparing yourself when you're going and updating something like a monitoring plan, considering what the EPA may ask you.
Yes, I can't remember the exact title. There is a supplemental publication that goes with the field auditor's manual. I believe it is an Appendix A that goes with that manual. It kind of takes you down into the various categories of an audit, almost like a check sheet that they would use for performing the audit. It's pretty handy. To begin, this is just a 30,000 foot overview of the certification process. Here we're talking about subpart C, where we learn about the process for recertification, certification or recertification of CEMS, the QA/QC requirements for these systems, definitions of your out of control periods, and bias adjustment of your SOX, NOx, and flow monitors, bias adjustment of them. Subpart G contains those reporting requirements for your notifications and certification, any monitoring plan work that needs to go on, your cert applications, emissions report associated with them, any special petitions you may have to file with the agency. But there are 5 steps that every CEMS has to go through, with the exception of LME, and they just have a slightly shorter list. You want to submit your initial monitoring plan. That would include the electronic and hard copy, generally to EPA and state, 21 days prior to your test. Same time you would submit those certification test notices, 21 days. You would then perform your certification testing as planned for whether your CEMS, low mass emitter, Appendix E, etc., and prepare your certification application. Submit that in both electronic and hard copy, because you want a backup, to both CAMD and the state and the region in 45 days. And here's where the agency can approve or disapprove. This is the waiting period. They can take upwards to 120 days, and if they haven't answered by then, the systems are certified by default until they do.
Now, one of these steps that folks here might want to consider is that if you're planning on using something like a Coriolis meter for flow, for fuel flow especially, then you may have to submit a petition to the EPA well in advance of these steps in order to get approval. And it's not likely that you're going to get disapproved, but if you're not thinking ahead, if you're not using one of the approved methodologies inside Part 75, it's something to consider to make sure your technology lines up with Part 75. And if you want to deviate from the approved technologies in your operations, you will have to submit a notice to the EPA and a request for using that type of technology. That's something that Trinity has done for years and has actually done for me at one point in time.
Yes, I remember that you and I had to do that write-up just recently. It is unfortunate that even though they describe a Coriolis meter, they don't call it out by name under Appendix D. They'll call out a Venturi, they'll call out a couple others, but Coriolis, even though it's been around forever and a day, they just describe it. They don't call it out by name.
Exactly.
Then we get into the system certification tests for full acid rain monitoring or Appendix D. You need to do a 7-day cal error test on all your CEMS analyzers. That includes your interference checks for stack flow. Everything needs to pass. All of it needs to be online. This is Part 75. Part 75 only cares about online operation. 3-point linearity check on your NOx, SOx, and diluent analyzers where applicable. Relative accuracy test, your RADA for SOx and NOx concentration, NOx diluent in pounds per million, your diluents, reload for stack flow, RADA test, a bias test, a cycle time test for each gaseous analyzer, and the DAS verification. And there are certain exceptions and qualifications for your unique setup if you're a peaking unit versus, you know, a very low sulfur fuel. For example, an SO2 monitor will be exempt from RADA at that point for that particular instance. Certain low span values for SOx or NOx, if you're less than or equal to 50 ppm, there's no 7-day drift. If your low range span is less than or equal to 30 ppm, there's no linearity check, but they revived that with the implementation of the MATS rule if you are using your SO2 CEMS as a surrogate in a mercury monitoring situation. Peaking units are exempted from the 7-day test as well. Your peakers and bypass stacks perform a single load RADA. There's just lots of exceptions and qualifications for some of
I'd
this
like
stuff.
to point out, yeah, there are, and here's one of them. And I'd like to point out that we don't mention Part 60 here on this slide because we're specifically speaking about monitoring plans, EDRs, ECMPS, Part 75. But when you're going through Part 75 system certification testing, I encourage you to go back to the language in your permit, in the air permit as it is written. And I have seen air permits not mention Part 60, even though you do have a CO analyzer at your site. And the permit may state you will follow all conditions of Part 75. You might have to work with your agency on that a bit to see if you're going to fully harmonize Part 60 and 75 and treat the CO analyzer as you would under Part 75. There are sites that do complete separate Part 60, Part 75 certification and recert tests.
Moving on, if you are categorized under Part 75 Appendix E style monitoring, your qualifications for doing so mean that you are part of the acid rain or CARE or Casper NOx program. You're defined as a peaking unit, meaning that your average annual capacity factor is less than or equal to 10% for 3 consecutive years, and that your annual capacity factor was less than or equal to 20% in any of those 3 years. Under Appendix E, you will do NOx emission rate testing and Appendix D style heat input measurement. You'll be tested at 4 distinct unit loads. And if you're a boiler, you'll monitor your XSO2, looking to determine a normal or conservatively high value. If you're a turbine or a diesel or reciprocating engine, you have to monitor your 4 NOx formation characteristics, whatever combination of 4 parameters. It's a healthy list. And perform a DAS verification, prove your equations work. The tests derive a NOx correlation curve for your NOx rate and heat input at each operating level. And assuming that you abide by the rules under Appendix E, you only have to retest every 5 years. If you're doing Appendix E methodology, while you're at it, you may want to explore low mass emitter status to see if you qualify there as well. The qualifications for it, not inclusive of any state exceptions, meaning you can't violate the permit, but you must be a gas or oil-fired unit, usually. Your SOx or NOx mass emissions can exceed certain yearly or ozone season limits. And that means 25 tons of SO2 annually, 50 tons of NOx during ozone season, or 100 tons of NOx per year. You'd use 3 years or seasons of your historical projection data to demonstrate this. Or we had 5 steps for other types of CEMS. Here you got 3. You submit your initial monitoring plan to the region and state. You submit your Cert app, both of them, 45 days or earlier. And then the agency can approve or disapprove around 120 days. Your systems are certified by default while you're waiting. Now, emission rate testing is not required on this unless the site wishes to determine a site-specific or unit-specific NOx emission factor. There are pluses and minuses to that I won't get into. But the point, the takeaway here is that your testing is very similar for LME to Appendix E certification, with the exception that your mass emissions are estimated using fuel-specific default factors, default emission factors. And your hourly heat input can be either estimated from your fuel records using like a long-term fuel flow method over the course of operation, or a maximum heat input value is used for each hour. I've seen it go both ways on this, and the closest, you get a lot closer to accuracy using a longer term fuel flow method than you do with maximum heat input. When they say max heat input, that means every hour is the maximum heat that you can output from the unit. Long-term fuel flow, you wind up having to go back and apportion fuel use for each hour. Anything on that, Adam? So we will probably finish this presentation a little early. I've been hearing a whole lot in the way of questions on this stuff, but here is our resource and contact info for the ESC Spectrum website. The main resource library available to you through ESC, and copy of their webinar, Staying Ahead of the Data Review Game, always a good thing to keep on top of. For general inquiries, there's your 512 number and Mr. Jackson's contact information at ESC. Here's my company's website, our contact information. There's my email. And I'm going to impress upon everybody again that these 2 publications, the Plain English Guide, the 2013 copy of the Emissions Monitoring Policy Manual, cannot stress that enough. It does clarify this stuff a lot. If you're new to it or you just have a question about it, I particularly enjoy the policy manual because I can go in there and research a subject. Even keeping a soft copy of it, I can go through and try and find keywords associated with the subject, and I usually find the answer that I'm looking for, or at least some resources that I can contact to find out clarifications. So before we adjourn for the day, Adam, are we seeing any questions coming through about the monitoring plan or certification process? Unfortunately, it sounds like we've lost Adam. He's probably out there storm chasing again. He got sucked up a funnel cloud. I want to thank everybody for. There you are.
No,
okay.
Yeah, no funnel clouds today. We had some heck of a weather here in Nebraska.
Okay.
All the questions were surrounded around the actual document. So there seems to be a lot of interest in what are the resources available to look at. And so I'm going to quickly recap that, and then we're going to send the links out. And there's another one that everybody here, Google is your friend. So if you Google the terms that I'm saying, it should be the first link that pops up with a PDF available that you can download and look at. There's one called Eliminating Bias in CEMS, and that's an EPA published document that provides components, every single component of a CEMS unit with all the possible failures, with the troubleshooting, with the solution. And you can utilize that for your CEMS QA/QC plan. You can utilize it for evaluating your monitoring plan and just in general training on CEMS. So eliminating bias in CEMS. And then the EPA field audit manual, we looked at it. It looks like it's been updated as recently as 2019. And that field audit manual still is relevant today. I think it was initially written in 2003. and go through each one of the interview sections of that field audit manual where they say, here's what you're going to do to prepare for a tabletop audit or visiting the site. Here's the documents that we're going to request as the EPA coming into the site. And so what I've done in my career managing CEMS is I built a folder structure that mapped back to that EPA field audit manual one for one, and I put a representative sample of each one of those items into the folder, up to including monitoring plan data, examples of monitoring plans over the years, my CEMS QA/QC requirement examples, and that way you have a representative sampling of data in the event that you do get audited by either your consultant or the EPA. And so those are two documents that I've used extensively, and we will definitely send those to you in a link through the email. So I want to thank everybody. Steve, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here.
Hey,
What's that?
Steve, I'm sorry, we got another request. Another question just came in. So
Okay.
It says, saying, can we go back to slide 22? We sure can.
Here's assuming that I numbered the slides. Boom, there we go. That, of course, is Adam's contact information at ESC Spectrum.
So I think people wanted to get our info so that way they can track us down.
Oh, no. They want Mr. Jackson's autograph. That's what it is. You got stalkers out there now, man. But yeah, the Part 75 CEMS Field Audit Manual and Appendix A that contains the audit forms that go with it, very handy,
Yep.
super helpful. It's pretty much all about mock auditing, kind of putting your system through the paces, your people through their paces to find out if you actually have all the information that you need to survive and thrive a field audit like that. Adam, do you see anything else coming through the questions pane?
Nope, I think that was it. I think they wanted to get the links and review the contact info. So I think we have wrapped up for today.
Okay. Thank you all, everyone, for coming out today. We're going to do part 4 of this. Adam, I can't remember the day. Is it the 29th?
I think so. Don't quote me on that. We'll definitely publish that and send out the email reminder for everyone to join.
Yeah, we will definitely put out some verbiage on that. But our next and final entry on this 4-part series is going to deal with Part 75 and the data substitution algorithms. Should be a scorcher. All right. For myself, I'm Steve Argabright. There's Adam Jackson. And thank you very much for coming out today. We'll be talking to y'all again soon. Thank you very much. Good day.